Well, welcome to everyone who has already joined us. It just hit 8 o'clock on my watch here. And so we're thrilled to have you as we continue our 3-week virtual version of the Leading for Good 2021 conference. And one of the beauties of this virtual world is that we can have people from around the world joining us in real time from where they are. And so this morning we have David Logan from our kind of friends in the UK. He is in lockdown, he shared, but what better way to spend lockdown than with a group of Americans who care about business for purpose. So welcome. Let me just share where we are in this 3-week journey. We are today in the Big Idea Power Chats that are a preview to the main conference that is coming up this Friday, for which you all should have received your usernames and logins. That will actually take place on a virtual platform with avatars and all. So it's our first attempt to be in the gamified world of this new way of connecting and interacting in conference space. And then next week, we're going to start our career coffees. And that is really focused on how do you, if you're inspired by what you've heard over these big ideas in the main conference, bring that into your career, especially for rising leaders who want to learn from some of the people that are far along at the intersection of profit and purpose. We have 2 big idea power chats still coming in the next day and a half. Later today, we have Renetta McCann, who is the Chief Inclusion Experience Officer with the Group. And I'm just going to mute everyone. Apologies.
Yeah, I'm doing this.
And so we are going to be excited to have her sharing her insights on delivering on inclusion. And then tomorrow, we have Mamadou Aboussar, who is the CEO of B Square and one of the foremost leaders in the world on the ESG movement. And he'll be sharing insights on that front. But let me stop sharing my screen now and start spotlighting who you are going to meet today. Carrie Miner is a phenomenal Baumhart scholar, as well as a leading fundraiser working for Mikvah Challenge, which is an extraordinary organization moving forward our democracy. David Logan is a longtime leader of the corporate citizenship movement as a consultant to companies around the world, and now is a 2-time author with the most recent authorship just coming out. And I just got a copy. And David, would you mind holding up your copy? It's such a fun experience for an author who spent all of their time putting in these words to actually see the finished product. Well, so with that, let me turn it over to you, Carrie, and I look forward to learning alongside our audience in this discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Seth, for that, and welcome everyone. Good morning to this Power Chat. As a current MBA student and Baumhart scholar who believes in social purpose and that's really pivotal for our businesses, I'm eager to have this conversation with David Logan and dig into this new book, which is hot off the press, so we're going to be the first to learn about it. But let me briefly introduce him before we begin. So David Logan is the co-founder of Corporate Citizenship, an international corporate social responsibility and sustainability consulting practice. He has over 40 years of experience frontline in corporate social responsibility in Europe, the US, and many emerging markets. Seth already got into his new book. The subtitle is Living with Modern Capitalism, which I love as an MBA student. We talk about that all the time. He argues that companies should be mandated to be socially responsible and collaborate with government and nonprofit sectors as a price for their freedom to do business. I find this really powerful. So let's dive in, David. A reminder, like Seth mentioned, there will be time at the end for questions for David from the audience, as well as small group discussions. But David, first, I'd love to turn it over to you with my first question. Just if you could briefly introduce yourself and maybe give us a snapshot of your career, how you got to where you are today. Looks like you're on mute.
So I should be off mute now. Carrie, thank you very much. I'm very happy to do this today with you at Loyola because I owe a great debt to my experience with the United States to learning about corporate social responsibility. So it's a pleasure for me to share what I've learned with you. I am a practitioner. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a person who lives in the world of ideas around corporate social responsibility. I've spent 40 years doing it on the front line. And just so you know, I'm now retired. I was born in 1947. I grew up in a mining town in England, and I went to the local state school, did an engineering apprenticeship. And in my late 20s, I worked for the labor unions in London. I was a socialist, and the great idea of my day was that society should be run without private companies. This was the whole purpose of the Communist Party in Russia and China, was to create a society where there was no private sector. The great issue of my young life, to all those of you who are students, was, should capitalism exist? And what has happened over my life, I worked for the labor unions. I left, I did 3 years in the voluntary, not-for-profit sector because I couldn't bear to possibly to apply for a job in the corporate sector. And then I joined Levi Strauss & Company as their community affairs manager for Europe. And one of the reasons I was able to join Levi's is I'd read a really good book called Levi's by Ed Cray. And there's a slim chapter in that book on how Levi's created racial equality in its factories in the Deep South in the 1950s. And I thought to myself, there's got to be something I can learn from these people. And I joined the staff of Levi's. I did 3 years in the UK, and I did 5 years in San Francisco at headquarters, where I ended my career working for the Social Responsibility and Ethics Committee of the company. So I learned in practice a huge amount about what it was to run a global business and to try and do it in an ethical and social responsible way. Did we always succeed? No, it's difficult. Life is difficult. But I learned a huge amount about how well-intentioned people, the Haas family that owned the business, wrestle with the problems of the power that comes to you when you're a business. So after that, I left Levi's, went back to the UK. I sometimes wonder when I look out of my window at the weather, what the hell I'm doing here and why I'm not still in California. I came back largely for personal and family reasons, started a consulting business, selling what I'd learned from working with Levi's to other international companies. And I've had a huge experience in countries like India, China, Vietnam, Uganda, Ghana, Peru, working on what it is to be a social, responsible, and ethical business in the modern world. So my journey has been from a pretty socialist perspective. I wasn't a left-wing, I was a right-wing Labour supporter. I'd fit into the middle or to slightly to the left of your Democratic Party when I was in my 20s. And I then ended up owning a business which we sold to another company. So I've made the personal journey across the spectrum of our social organizations. And a key part of that has been what I have done with and learned from American companies. I first came in contact with Loyola through Jen Griffin, who at that time was working at George Washington. She would come to London and bring parties of students. I always enjoyed talking to them. They seemed to like listening to me because when you're in an academic institution, you have one way of looking at the problems. And then when you listen to me, you kind of see it. You know, what are the problems of closing the largest dynamite factory in India? Let me tell you, that's a pretty explosive situation. So I would give them the war stories that made all of this theory real. And subsequently, I had done a lot of work with Abbott, which is a local company for you in Chicago. I'm still on their global advisory committee. And this has brought me into contact with Seth and the university where Jen is now teaching. And I've enjoyed the opportunity to engage with Americans because I believe at the core of this whole issue of corporate responsibility and sustainability, the experience of the Anglo-American companies is absolutely central and critical, but not definitive. So that's my career. I'm now retired. I live in Sussex. You can't see it at the moment. The sun is shining. In addition to writing a book about corporate responsibility, I've written a book about my little dog called The Adventures of Coco the Cockapoo. And in some ways, I'm prouder of that than I am of this one, which is really me just putting down on paper what I've learned from a lifetime of experience of moving from the socialist left into the private enterprise world and trying to make it more socially responsible and environmentally sustainable.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, David. We really should have highlighted the book about the dog. Next make sure that makes a presence. That sounds really fun.
Written for the under fives, let me tell you.
And I will say, I took Professor Griffin's course, and she pitted us against each other and showed us the complications and kind of the confusion around corporate social responsibility with all the different stakeholders. We each played a role, and it was really interesting, which is related because I think your book dives into those issues, right? Companies historically have not been mandated to be socially responsible. They do it sometimes, but not always. So can you speak to us a little bit about your new book, again, Companies for Good, Living with Modern Capitalism, and maybe talk about your experiences around the globe and if you're seeing certain countries doing better or maybe who are further along than others?
Yeah, let me start by saying the early part of the book, I spent looking at the fact that the world's first multinationals were established in Mesopotamia in 2000 BC. Private enterprise has been part of human culture since the first days of reading and writing. And indeed, a great deal of reading, writing, and arithmetic was invented to help their companies. Government took it on to help tax them. And then very much later, artists and writers took on reading and writing and arithmetic, because while companies and governments were trying to deal with the business of running life and running these multinational companies, the world of arts was all verbal. All of the great poems, all of the great religious teachings were taught verbally, not in reading and writing. It was private companies which began in 2000 BC, multinationals trading. That was very important for me because it showed me that modern capitalism, as we understand it, was not a product of Western European industrialization, which is very much how the Marxists described it. And you have to realize in reading my book, you're Americans. To quite a large extent, I've written it for my European and British counterparts, because we grew up thinking that capitalism and colonialism were a product of the Victorian era. It's not. Private enterprise has been part of human culture since the beginnings of time. And what I say in the book is the world has now moved on, and you can trace the pattern of company formation over the centuries. The world has now moved on, and we have brought back capitalism on a worldwide basis. It started in China in 1977-78. Deng Xiaoping declared he was going to create capitalism with Chinese characteristics. In 1979, Mrs. Thatcher was elected in England. 1980, Mr. Reagan was elected in the United States, and the whole world zeitgeist changed from one where government was going to do it all, which was absolutely the case for the communists, to one where the for-profit sector had to be brought back into the economy. And when you bring the for-profit sector back and give it more power, you have the question of responsibility. With power always goes responsibility. The two are intimately connected. And Mrs. Thatcher denationalized British Rail, British Steel, British Coal, British Airways, British Gas, British buses. They were all owned by the state, and she put them into the private sector. And once you'd done that, you had to have a general theory about how those institutions, as private institutions, would relate to society. And my book describes that process and then says the world has now moved on critically with the environmental crisis to a point where we want capitalism, but we don't want it to wreck the planet or to be engaged in exploitative and socially reprehensible activities. So I argue in what I call a new social contract with business, that the experience I've had of working with people like the heads of Levi's and Abbott and others who try to do the right thing voluntarily must now be changed to the point where we say to people, we want what capitalism can offer us in terms of the creativity and expansion of opportunities it brings. But the price you have to pay is you must pay regard to your social and environmental impacts and manage them creatively and positively. I don't say how to do that, but I say that every company, as part of the price of being free to be a private enterprise in the marketplace, you have to have a responsibility to be socially responsible and environmentally sustainable. So that's where I've arrived at over all these years.
Great. Well, I also didn't realize the history, and I'm glad you put that to writing so we can all learn about it in more detail. I think the historical context is really key. And as someone who worked in a labor union, I'm curious what you think the role of labor unions are moving forward. Is that a part of this social responsibility space, or do we need to rethink how we go about labor contracts?
Yes, I don't talk a lot in the book about labor unions, but I believe that labor unions are an integral and necessary and vital part of the package of modern democracy. So I talk about living with modern capitalism, but in actual fact, what I'm talking about is living with modern democracy. Because I think in addition to the labor unions, we have these activist NGOs who are campaigning around government policy, but also around corporate policy. And they actually emerged in Britain around the 1780s, at the time that the British economy was starting to become a global economy. What you had was the campaign, a very, very good book written by an American called Adam Hochschild, called Bury the Chains, which is about the campaign organized by not-for-profits to persuade government to make it illegal for companies to have slaves. Because companies had discovered a mass market for tea and sugar, and they wanted a mass labor force to produce it, so they organized the Atlantic slave trade. And the not-for-profit community, which I argue strongly in the book, of which the labor unions are a part, because they're voluntary organizations, is a critical part of keeping capitalism healthy. So I don't make a special case for the unions, but I fit them into this broad spectrum of people. You could include Amnesty International, Oxfam, the labor unions. They're all about campaigning and arguing for better behavior by business. And to that respect, they're essential, along with a free press and the rule of law. Without them, you wouldn't have the articulation of new perspectives on what business is doing. So I'm still a supporter of the trade unions in principle. They can be a bit of pain in the backside to companies from time to time, but they are an integral part of our democracy.
Absolutely. Well, the organization where I work, we help young people get involved in our democracy. And so I couldn't agree with you more. It's a really pivotal part of this conversation. So I'm glad you brought government and labor unions into this. I'm wondering if you can share an example of a company that you believe is emulating social good through their work today. You mentioned Levi Strauss when you got early on in your career, but what is a company or two now that you think is doing great corporate social responsibility work?
Well, each generation brings to the fore a new group of companies that have a social mission and a desire to use their power constructively. And I think, Kerry, the key thing is when you run a business, you have a small slice of power. And your main preoccupation is to run the business, promote your products and services, make a profit, But while you're doing that, there's a whole bunch of questions you must ask on how you treat people, how you treat the environment, how your suppliers treat their people, and how they treat the environment. So when you become a business owner or leader, you are exercising power over a small part of the economy, or in the case of a Walmart or an ExxonMobil, a large part of the economy. And the decisions you make have an impact. So what you have now in this current time is you have the B Corporation movement, for example, which is trying to articulate a response to this situation. I mean, when I was in California, I was influenced by people like Paul Hawken, who wrote a book called Growing a Business. And you had a whole bunch of companies like, I mean, Levi's in a way were the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And I've just finished working with a chemical company in Britain called Scott Bader, which is an employee-owned company. And along with cooperatives, employee ownership was seen as the answer to capitalism. But it's only a partial answer. And what you have now are companies like Patagonia, Innocent Drinks, Ben and Jerry's, Anita Roddick with Body Shop, all trying to reinterpret this will to run a business in a responsible way in a new context. And so each generation brings forward its own leaders. And what I argue in my book is we can no longer rely on the voluntary commitment of this minority of leaders, like the people talk about what Levi's and Patagonia did in the garment industry, but they're a tiny part of the garment industry. You know, it's a huge industry. And what I'm arguing in the book is there's enough examples of good behavior for other companies to pick up if we require them to do so.
Great. Thank you for that context. I think that is really helpful. And you named many organizations that we're talking about in our MBA program, and I hope that the list grows. I imagine many people on this call, like myself, are hoping to make an impact wherever they work, at whatever level they're working within their company. Can you share, as a practitioner, what can individuals do to encourage their organizations to move away from focusing only on shareholder value to incorporating social good into their missions and their everyday work?
Okay, good question. I have to deal all the time, and you're in Chicago, the home of Milton Friedman, and you know, Milton Friedman is very handy. When Karl Marx, Milton Friedman, and Joe Stiglitz all agree that the purpose of business is to maximize profits, I do get suspicious. I don't actually believe that. There is a book I used when I was at Levi's, I'll show it to you now, called the Mission Statement Book. If you are a worker in a company, or if you are you need to know what its mission and value statements are. Because when you look at the mission statement book, I can find very, very few examples of companies saying, we will maximize your profits. Very few. The ones that do say we will maximize, but provided it doesn't impact our relations with other stakeholders. And what you have in people like Johnson & Johnson, you have a one-page credo that says this is what we stand for. I've worked a lot with the British company Vodafone. They want to be the world's largest mobile phone business. But while that is their commercial mission, they also have statements about their social and environmental missions. So if you're a worker in these companies, get to know what the values of the business are and try and hold your company to its own values. I get a lot of pressure in my work as a consultant. Oh, can we do what GRI says? Can we do what B Corp says? And I say, well, let's do what you think is right, first and foremost. And have you thought through what you think is right? And have you written it down? And what you saw with a lot of companies like Marks and Spencer here in Britain, the big retailer, Cadbury, I worked on the Cadbury account. When the last family member left Cadbury's, he asked to write down a statement of values that said what the business is about. And I remember at Levi's when we were working there, the Code of Business Principles was an attempt to quantify and set out in detail the values that the family had founded the business on. So that is the key to me as a worker. And I've known people within companies. I knew a young woman in Levi's, Martha Montag Brown. She now runs a consulting firm in Los Angeles. She went to the leadership of the company and said, this is our value. You cannot close this factory. I was gobsmacked. This rather junior person said that, and she got the attention of the leadership of the company because she said, you are not living out your values by closing this factory in a rather rapid and unstructured way. You are not living out your history, you're not living out your values. And she forced a rethink about that plant closure. So you can do it, but you need to have a hunting license. You need to have a hook on which to hang your argument. And I believe that hook is the values that the company themselves put out. It's not saying, oh, GRI say this. You have said, this is how you will behave. are we behaving according to your own values and principles? And that is the key to getting the attention of senior leadership, I think.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. And I agree with you. Every company is different and really has to speak to its own truth. But one question that I do have based on your book, and this will be the last question before we turn it over to the audience. So prepare your questions. We'll ask you to raise your hand. But David, in your book, you argue that companies should be mandated to play a corporate socially responsible role. What would a mandate look like, and how would we begin the process of organizing that across the United States, Europe, the world? What does that look like?
Well, in my book, I write for my UK audience, essentially. There are 7,500 large companies in the UK, of which a minority, about 15%, are listed. The genius of capitalism is it lets ordinary citizens launch initiatives in the economy and grow them. And what I've said is that we have a lot of experience going back to people like Hershey and Carnegie, who voluntarily took initiatives to try and address the great social issues of the day. And very much they were issues of employee treatment back in the Victorian period. What has happened in the world, and it's a rather thin argument in the book because it's a very broad discussion, but what has happened in the world is the world's moved on. We've got a much better educated workforce now than we had even 50, 60 years ago. We have an environmental crisis, which is absolutely pressing. I make the point, I think, that so long as there are people, we will argue about social and economic matters. But environmental matters, they are a hard stop. When a species is extinct, it's extinct. When the climate has gone up 3 degrees, there's no going back. You can't argue about things like diversity and equality and pay. And I think we'll be arguing that forever. But with the environment, and that is a huge change in my time. When I worked for Levi's, we did very little on the global environment. I remember shooing away NGOs that came to us complaining about the negative impacts on the environment of cotton. We make jeans. If you want to know about cotton, go and talk to Milliken Mills in Spartanburg, North Carolina. They know about cotton. We know about jeans. But your brand is on the jeans, they said, and they were quite right. That change means that I think we now must say to all companies, we want you back. We have overcome our fantasy of having a society without private enterprise. The communists were some of the first to abandon it. We want you back, but we need you to be a partner in helping us address these social and environmental problems. Now, I would make that a legal responsibility. And in Britain, we have a Companies Act, which has section 172, which has a very kind of weak statement that companies should take into account the concerns of other stakeholders. There's a campaign now in Britain to very much along the lines of which I've been writing to say, actually, it's too feeble. You must have a strategy for the environment. You must have a strategy for your social and economic impacts. We're not telling you what that strategy is or even how to write it, but you must have one as part of the license of being free to trade in the marketplace. And you must report each year on what you think your obligations are and how you are meeting them and what progress you're making. So that's the position I've come to, because 80% of the people who work in the United Kingdom, I'm not sure what the figure is for the United States, work in the private sector. It is the force that shapes our culture. And instead of trying to have societies without a private sector, let's learn how to make it work with us to solve the problems we have. And that's where I argue for a new social contract between business and society, underpinned by a simple legal requirement for business to have a strategy for sustainability and social responsibility.
Really interesting. Thank you. And just to echo that 80% of people work for corporations, that's a huge number and really powerful testament to why we need this change.
It is. I mean, and you get a lot of comment from Oxfam and others about the top 2% that make trillions and are very rich. That is an issue of public policy. You have to do something about that. But the vast majority of capitalism are small to medium-sized businesses who are getting on with the day-to-day stuff of providing the goods and services that are our lives. If you look around you, all those books, those bookcases, your clothes, your glasses, they all came from the private sector. They didn't come from the government. And one of the things that Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan brought back into the debate was, Mrs. Thatcher had this phrase, government's job is to steer, not to row. The people who do the rowing are the private sector. And that is where the rubber hits the road when it comes to environmental and social problems.
Interesting. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I will add, my books did not come from Amazon. So, we're going to go to Q&A from the audience. I see one person has their hand raised. Just a reminder to raise your hand. You click on participants in the bottom of your screen, and then you'll see a raise hand button. So you'll just click that. So I'm going to ask you to come off of mute and you can ask your question to David. Nicole Johnson, I see you first, so we'll come to you. And then William, I know you had a question as well. So after Nicole, we'll come to you next. Nicole, if you'd like to come off mute.
Hi, good morning. It's good to be here and taking all the wisdom. I learned some new things about the historical context, and I'll definitely follow up on that. But I had a question. In the last few minutes of your presentation, you mentioned how, and I think it was like the section that you all have in the Companies Act, where essentially it seems that these are things that that the government wants companies to consider and show I guess, progress at the end of the